Welcome to PPLS Perspectives, a podcast bringing students and academics together to explore the research carried out by the University of Edinburgh's School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences and the impact this work has on society.
Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of PPLS Perspectives podcast from the School of Psychology, Philosophy and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. As a wee recap for you, this is the rebranded podcast from the previous PPLS podcast, which was previously called Forward Thinking and Active Pre-Pandemic. This new but old podcast was started off very successfully with the pilot episode on the philosophy of grief a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, I really recommend checking it out. But if you're new here or just fancy hearing me speak for a wee bit longer, our goal is to provide a short, bite-sized chunks of the work of our faculty members, why it is important and the impact this has on society. My name is Gilly Marchini. I'm a second year PhD linguistics student here at the University of Edinburgh. My PhD research focuses on the documentation of underrepresented varieties of Spanish, particularly those spoken by ethnically marginalised groups. My current project seeks to document the phonetic and phonological features of Afro-Mexican Spanish and analyse how these may diverge from previously held assumptions about Spanish. Today I'm joined by my colleague and friend Christian Ilbury, a lecturer in sociolinguistics at the University of Edinburgh. Christian received his PhD in linguistics at Queen Mary University in 2019 and has held various posts at a number of UK institutions prior to joining the department in 2022. Christian's research is sociolinguistic in nature, examining the ways in which language may vary and change according to various social factors. This has ranged from Christian's work into the influence of digital engagement on language use, to the role of gender, age and sexuality on language variation. Critical to today's podcast is Christian's work on accent bias and his passion for addressing and tackling accent elitism. I'll ask Christian to elaborate more on these terms presently. Prior to this, however, I will first provide a wee rundown of how the podcast works. Keeping the structure consistent with our last episode, I will ask Christian a series of 5 questions with some discussion in between. The first of these is an elevator pitch. So for context, this is a brief overview of your research and arguments that is concise yet detailed enough to pitch to somebody in an amount of time it takes to roughly share an elevator or lift, so approximately 2 minutes. So Christian, we're here today to talk about your research and work on tackling accent bias. So could you give us your elevator pitch on this, please?
Yeah, so I think what we're doing here is addressing accent as a form of discrimination, right? So people make judgments about someone's social background, they infer social information on the basis of the way that somebody speaks, right? And a lot of the time that is to do with accent. And on the whole, these kind of judgments, these kind of inferences are not problematic, but they have the potential to become problematic, such as when you're distinguishing between 2 possible job candidates.
Great, that was lovely and precise. So what inspired you to carry out this research?
So I've been doing some research with a large-scale ESRC funded project called Accent Bias in Britain with Professor Devyani Sharma and Professor Erez Lebon at Queen Mary University of London. So I was engaged in that project as a postdoc, and so my research with that project is a continuation of the kind of themes, the kind of approaches that we did on that project. And I think as a sociolinguist, we're all very aware that language is something that people make judgments about someone on the basis of. But I think in society as a whole, this recognition is not really there, right? People talk about racism, they talk about sexism, they talk about homophobia, but these are often thought of in, overt terms, right? What someone actually says. When actually people probably do that kind of stuff, but in a more indirect way, right? Like judging someone on the way that they speak can do that same kind of level of discrimination. So really I've kind of been inspired by a broader social justice movement in sociolinguistics to both, tell people that this exists and also try and understand how it exists in all its forms. How do people make these levels of discrimination? How do people decide between accents that are prestigious and accents that are pleasant, and why those associations come to be?
Wow, that's really interesting. And it seems to be a very nuanced look at accent bias and accent discrimination. And obviously, we are living in the UK. You're conducting your research within the UK, where class is such a taboo topic.
Yeah.
And it's a very indirect, you said it's a very indirect discrimination.
Yeah.
It's not spoken about. So I'm just wondering, what does that mean in terms of the methods? What methods do you employ to look at accent bias?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Accent Bias in Britain project did was basically ask people to evaluate accent labels. So this is just if you present someone a label like received pronunciation or Birmingham and you ask them to rank the UK accents in terms of their prestige, what you find is that at the top of the prestige scale is a accent that we associate with the social elite, right? Very few people in the UK speak it. It was often called the Queen's English or the King's English now, but it's received pronunciation. So that often gets rated very highly, whereas ethnic minority accents and accents associated with former industrial towns, which have, working class connotations, are generally rated very low in terms of their prestige. And like I say, on the whole, we all have biases, right? Biases are simplified ways of thinking about the world. And on the whole, these are not problematic. They only have the potential to become problematic when someone overgeneralizes them, when they use them to make judgments about non-linguistic information. So whilst accent might map onto, somebody's social background, it doesn't map onto things like intelligence, right? That is a leap much too far in trying to infer social information about someone. So we've done this kind of experimental work, and in another part of the project, we basically looked at how people experience, and this is the Sutton Trust report that we published. We looked at how people experience accent bias at different stages of their life. So just before they're coming into university, when they're at university, and then when they're in the workplace. And what you find is that people at university tend to experience the most accent kind of awareness and the kind of fear that their accent might hold them back in their future. So this is something that I'm interested in understanding why. So in that study, we found that 56% of students from the north of England have had their accent actually mocked in a social setting. And because of this might lead to anxieties about, your accent as telling someone something that about you yourself, or about something that's completely unrelated.
And do you have any inclination as to why it's happening at university? Obviously, we're at a university podcast right now, so I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know, okay, why do you think this environment?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about a university, like previously when you're at school, you go to a school in your area, probably, where very many people come from the same area, potentially the same background as you. Like secondary school I went to, the individuals, my fellow students, my friends, were very similar to me, right? And then you are brought to a university, many people travel, quite far to get there, right? And then you get people from all different backgrounds, and you suddenly realise, oh, I'm actually quite different, right? I speak differently to this person, or like they say butter and I say butter. And, as linguists, we know that there's nothing inherently wrong or correct about one way of pronouncing that word, or any way of using language. It's just language. But I think students then start to recognize that people do hold these perceptions, right? And they meet people from different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. And so I think in that kind of microcosm of society, accent anxiety is increased. It's also a time where, you're thinking about your future, you're thinking about transitioning into a profession, into a job where potentially you've been told that there's a certain way of speaking or an expected way of speaking for that profession.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems to make sense. It seems to track with societal expectations, especially when you reach that age of 18. At that age, you're going to... Suddenly there's much more pressure on you to conform to a certain adult way of existing. So that makes sense. And we've already touched upon this, but obviously it is quite a taboo subject still, accent bias. And I was just wondering, could you speak on why you think that is?
Yeah, so we as linguists always say, and you'll be familiar with this, old rolled out phrase, that accent bias or accent linguistic discrimination is the last remaining, and in scare quotes, acceptable form of discrimination, because people are, in my experience, just do not think of this as discrimination. And like I say, very few people in a job interview, in a hiring panel, will say things like, I couldn't understand them because of their accent. They wouldn't say it, explicitly, but they might use, ways of suggesting that that's what they're talking about, right? Like they're not an effective communicator, or, like they haven't got the kind of polish that we're looking for. Often that is used as a kind of euphemism for something else that's going on, right? So in my experience, I don't think people are really aware that this discrimination happens and that accent bias is a thing. I think especially in the UK, it's always packaged up in like banter, right? Like people think mocking someone for their accent is actually me being pally, right? Like down the pub with my mates, right? I can take the mick out the guy who's a Geordie, right? That is, in my experience, what I think most people think of when it comes to dynamics of accent bias. And I also think, sociolinguistics, we're kind of a niche subject. I don't think we've always done the best job at communicating this problem, but I think people are starting to think about it now. There has been this drive for social justice more generally in society, and I think people are thinking about language as one of those dimensions at which people are discriminated against.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely entering the public consciousness a lot more than it had. For example, when I went to university with a weird Northern Irish accent, it was just constant mocking. So that really does seem to make sense to me. But obviously it's a new thing. We're starting to talk about it more. What are the challenges of conducting this kind of research? Yeah,
so that's a great question. And I think one of them is what I've just described is a lack of awareness of what we're actually talking about. So, and you'll know as well, like a sociolinguist, when we argue that there is nothing inherently wrong about one language variety or one way of speaking than another, you often get people conflating this with the idea that we're, telling people they can write how they want, right? What we're talking about is speech, right? And we're talking about someone's accent. And there are, two different dimensions here. And we're not kind of saying, everyone can use just however they want to speak. We know that there are rules, there are systems in place in language which influence and constrain how somebody speaks. So it isn't just like throw the rule book out and let people, use these random varieties of English or any language. It's systematic, it's structured, so we should respect the linguistic diversity. But it's an uphill battle, right? Because so on the one hand, people don't understand what we're talking about. And also I think, as you said earlier, we're a nation where social class is so ingrained into the fabric of everything we do, everything we say. It's class oriented. And I think we've got better at talking about it, but it is still for very many people a taboo subject to raise the issue that, working class students might experience pressure from their privately educated peers to speak in a certain way or to act in a certain way. I think that's still, something that it's a conversation that some people feel very uneasy about. And so I hope, as part of the broader social justice movement, that people now have the words, the language to be able to talk about this. And I think, it works both ways. We have a job as sociolinguists to communicate this stuff. And also I think we need, society in, as kind of an idealist view, to kind of engage with this as a possible transformation or a movement.
Yeah, and if there are budding linguists listening, and they are saying, look, this is something I'm really passionate about, I want to get into this, what advice would you give them?
Yeah.
For those looking, because obviously there are challenges with this kind of research. So what would your advice be?
Yeah, so I feel like every time we talk about accent bias and linguistic discrimination, it can kind of feel a bit demotivating because you're like, here is a problem, and the question is, well, what do we do about it? And in Accent Bias Britain, the conclusion was one of the most effective interventions is simply to tell people that this is a problem, right? It works when people become aware of linguistic discrimination and accent bias. So I'd say to, like, budding linguists, people who are interested in this, talk to people, right? And tell them that this is an issue, right? So if you hear someone mocking someone's accent, call them out for it, right? And say, you don't think that's a particularly great thing to do, right? Because it does map onto ethnicity, it maps onto sexuality, it maps onto all of these dimensions that we have become, very aware of. So I think try not to become despondent, but rather if we all make these kind of tiny little changes in our everyday practice, I think we can all contribute in some way to deconstructing the assumptions that are underlying linguistic discrimination or accent bias.
Absolutely. Little actions.
Yeah.
Awareness.
Yeah.
Awareness that this is a problem, because it is something that is very much under the radar, unfortunately. So speaking upon that, there's stuff that you are doing with the accent bias project, but where is the impact of this? Where can you see this work going?
Yeah, so already this year, our research informed a large policy document, research document by the Sutton Trust. So the Sutton Trust are a highly influential social mobility charity whose research goes into informing governmental level policy. And so our research got taken up by the Sutton Trust. The report had a huge press release. It was covered by Sky News, by BBC, by The Guardian. And so from that, we had a huge amount of conversations, right? Media appearances where people, were asking about what this is, right? So I think that's where the impact comes from, is raising awareness of this being an issue. And like I said earlier, one of the hopes is you raise awareness of an issue, people become more aware of it, right? And they start to address it in their own practice. So, potentially this has social mobility benefits in terms of, accent could be one of the dimensions that someone is discriminated on the basis of. And if we address the underlying biases, we address the underlying assumptions about that individual, then we can stop accent becoming a barrier to social mobility. And so, some of the tools, some of the resources that we developed as part of the Accent Bias Britain project have gone into this, right? We've developed recruitment tools, staff training, student training to help raise basically the profile of accent bias and linguistic discrimination.
Great. And just I'm aware that a couple of weeks ago or last week you held an event.
Yep.
So could you perhaps talk about what that event was and what benefit that had for the University of Edinburgh specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the first year that I taught a course called sociolinguistics, I had a student in that class, Andrew Wilson, who runs a society called the 93% Club. They represent state-educated students at the University of Edinburgh. And I had another student, Claire Ellison, from Tackling Elitism. And we both kind of, came up with the idea that from the week on language and social justice, we should develop an event that addressed accent bias at the University of Edinburgh, right? So have an open discussion about student experiences here at the university. And so then from that planning, I then worked with the two current presidents, Grace and Holly, to develop this evening, actually last week, looking specifically at accent bias. So we heard from two external speakers, Professor Julia Snell and Ian Cushion, who both work on language and social justice issues. And then we had a panel in which we invited students from the university to talk about their own experiences here and how they think we as a university should be addressing language and social justice issues, or accent bias and linguistic discrimination. And so really this is hoped to be the beginning of a more general work kind of project with these two student societies, where we're addressing this issue at the university. So it's an issue in all parts of life, obviously, but what we can actually do is turn the focus on ourselves, and how can we support students from working class backgrounds who have non-standard or non-standardized accents, and how can we better integrate their voices in the classroom. So from that, I'll be developing some staff training materials. We hope that this will be the first of many events. So yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, listeners, stay tuned. This is going to be good stuff. So just sort of last question.
Mm-hmm.
So you've already mentioned you're developing these staff training, but are there any more next steps you think that we can take within the University of Edinburgh, or perhaps at a more general level, to help tackle accent bias?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that we really need is diversification, right? We, in all walks of life, if you hear someone who sounds like you in a position that you never imagined yourself in, because, that's not what your family did, or that's what you were told you would never be able to do by some teacher or someone at some point. If you hear someone that sounds like you, speaks like you, that is so transformational. And I think that's what we can do, is try and fight for representation. So representation, linguistic diversity, representation in diversity in all its forms. And my hope is through that, we hear more diverse voices, right? And the idea that there is one way of speaking or one correct accent it starts to fall apart, right? Because if you have people in power, powerful positions who sound like you, or sound, like how you think people from your home sound, then that is incredibly, empowering. So I think that's one of my hopes. I think on a more general level, it is simply just telling people that this is, an issue, and we're almost at Christmas, right? And these kind of conversations come up, right? Around family dinner, or down the pub, after on a Friday afternoon. Yeah. I'm sure people make comments that are shrouded in kind of linguistic bias or accent bias or whatever. And when you hear them, you should, try and feel empowered to tackle them.
Great. Okay then, so before we go, where can somebody find out more about your work?
Yeah, so I would suggest either looking at the Accent Bias in Britain website, which we can link, or having a look at the Sutton Trust report that we wrote this year. And all of that work that I've spoken about just now is in that report.
Great. That's fabulous. I'm sure people will be checking that out.
Cool.
So I think that's where we're going to wrap up now. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. This has been a PPLS Perspectives podcast with Christian Ilbury, interviewed by Gilly Marchini. We hope you've learned stuff, and be sure to check out our other episodes.